I mean, I think it's far more likely that whatever is being cooked up by the BRICS countries is behind the rising price of oil. And I don't think that the war in the Middle East is necessarily all that important to the price of oil. And we would assume that the war in the Middle East would be far more important to the price of oil, especially if some of the key shipping lanes come under further assault. You know, the Straits of Hormuz and all of that standard stuff would be a substantial crisis, to be sure. So I think the price of gold is doing its own thing, independent of what's going on in the Middle East.
Hey guys, my name is Danny. You're watching Capital Cosm, and today we've got Doomberg back on the show. Doomberg, thank you so much for coming back on, my friend.
Danny, great to be here.
Yeah, definitely. It's always great to hear from you, Doomberg, especially now with all of this geopolitical insanity going on around the world. It's good to get your take on the energy markets and the markets as a whole and how they relate to geopolitics and how you see it. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you to hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already to get more videos like this on your YouTube feed, as well as check out our Substack. Link to that is down below for more perks than you can than we can offer here on YouTube. You'll get exclusive access to certain portions of these interviews that you won't find here on YouTube as well, exclusively on Substack. Link is down below. All right, Doomberg, let's just dive right in. As I ask all of my guests to kind of kick things off, I want to see where your mind's at. I want to see what your current view is on the landscape, so to speak. What do you see out there in terms of a general perspective as it relates to the economy, geopolitics, the world in general, how they all interconnect? What's top of radar for you right now?
A few things. Obviously, we are energy focused on our Substack, and so as we survey the global energy landscape today, we find markets that are relatively well supplied. We find still an abundance of natural gas in North America, although things are changing there and becoming quite interesting. We are seeing very strong evidence of a nuclear renaissance. I would think the shocking announcement that the remaining reactor at 3 Mile Island would not only be reopened, but basically be dedicated to the task of creating electricity for Microsoft so that it could power its data centers is a real milestone. We also wrote recently about the big banks finally getting behind nuclear and treating it in the same way that they do wind and solar from a sustainability perspective. I think those are all sort of earthquake type headlines that will be remembered for years to come. Geopolitics, of course, we have the war seemingly winding down in Ukraine and winding up in the Middle East. The potential for a wider war in the Middle East has never seemed higher. And despite all of that, the oil markets are behaving as though such a wider war will be avoided. Much of what we have been predicting for the past year in terms of engine switching and that being a bearish headwind for oil and oil products is playing out in some ways faster even than we thought it might. So all told, absent a major war in the Middle East, the only other major uncertainty on the board is the U.S. election, which is, assuming both candidates make it to the end line, is probably going to be a fascinating event to watch, one which is difficult to predict the fallout from.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take those one by one, starting off with this essentially anti 3 Mile Island event, which is the reopening of 3 Mile Island. What are the ramifications of this in the immediate term, or so let's say the medium term, when it comes to the uranium market for uranium investors out there? Is this something that the price can react to? It does appear like the price has reacted to the news, but what are some of the impacts to the uranium price and just the overall market there?
Well, I think first of all, it's unabashedly bullish for the entire nuclear sector and uranium, to the extent that uranium is tied to it. One has to acknowledge that it is also likely bullish for uranium. How much of that is already priced in remains to be seen, of course. I think what we're seeing, and I have to give credit to Mark Nelson, who is a brilliant nuclear analyst, and he recently had an appearance on Dr. Chris Kiefer's wonderful podcast, Decouple, where he talked about essentially the need for speed to bring on ultra high quality baseload electricity to power these data centers. Lays bare the fallacy of intermittent renewable energy as any form of a solution for what humanity ultimately needs. But more importantly, from the perspective of nuclear, he laid out, I think, an excellent point, which is there's this cost curve of nuclear that can either be brought back online or expanded at sites that already have a license, or all the way down to new builds at greenfield sites. This is pretty well sketched out, and restarting nuclear reactors that have been preserved in a way that makes such restarts feasible is the easiest and quickest way to bring significant amounts of new electricity online. And because many of these will be dedicated, you are not limited by the lack of transmission and grid connection and all the other issues. And so this is all well sketched out. I'm trying to get my hands on the exact list that he mentioned on that podcast, but it does make sense. You have a perfectly good reactor sitting there. You just need to restart it, refuel it, refurbish it. Then you may have permitted expansions at existing facilities that were built with such expansions in mind and are already sort of pre-approved, all the way to building brand new ones. And they'll go through that list before they build a brand new one.
Right. And then when you mentioned oil essentially being de-risked in the face of rising tensions, rising probabilities of war, let's say, in the Middle East and Lebanon and Israel and all of that stuff going on there, why is oil essentially being de-risked here? It seems very counterintuitive.
Well, right now there's essentially no geopolitical risk embedded in the price of oil, which is fascinating. The way we measure geopolitical risk, at least the way we have recently measured it, is just take the cost of landed LNG in Europe and multiply it by 5.8 and compare it to the price of Brent crude. And they're basically trading in lockstep on an energy content basis. And so there is no premium in the market for oil. The market is basically pricing that war risk will be contained in the Middle East. Who knows? If you believe that the market is pricing it wrong, then you probably want to get long oil. But there are some significant bullish or bearish headwinds to oil that need to be mentioned. One is the pace at which cheap natural gas in China is being used to displace demand for diesel, and frankly, electric vehicles and their proliferation in China is being used to displace the demand for gasoline. And both of those, while only displacing a few percent of total demand, as you know, oil and oil products are highly inelastic, and it doesn't take but a few percent for prices to remain contained. Also, a piece we wrote to some controversy last month called How OPEC Ends. Again, the speed with which the predictions we made in that piece are beginning to come true is interesting to us. Very fascinated by the story that broke late last week that Saudi Arabia looks set to abandon its so-called $100 per barrel of oil price target, and it will basically seek to regain lost market share as it has tried to bring the price of Brent back up to the $80 to $90 range that everybody seemed happy with. And so that could be particularly bearish for price. Again, all of this is predicated on no major war in the Middle East. If there's a major war in the Middle East, all bets are off. Oil could go to $200. Like that would be a temporary spike that one should fade. But such spikes happen, and people make a lot of money betting on them. But so I think absent a war, the sort of equilibrium or break-even price for oil is in the mid-50s, I'd say. And that's not a number that is pleasing to bullish investors, but we could go below that, of course. But if we just sort of look at where oil should trade based on various calculations, the mid-50s seems to be a sweet spot.
Yeah, it does appear to, if there is a war, it most likely will be contained. Iran is sending out signals that they don't really want to get involved, or at least in a very explicit capacity, as are a bunch of other Gulf Arab states as well. So it does appear like it might be just contained within the borders of Lebanon. So we'll see how that transpires. Next up on the list, you mentioned the elections. So talk to us about the election. What's the current dynamic now that you see? What are the impacts that could result following, let's say, a Harris win versus a Trump win? And what are you looking at more in terms of policy in regards to the two candidates?
Well, we see three possible outcomes: a clean win by either candidate or a heavily disputed election. And frankly, a heavily disputed election seems to be the lead horse in that three-horse race at the moment, and that is very difficult to predict the consequences of. But if we assume a clean win by either candidate, we have a slightly counterintuitive view If Trump wins, that is bullish for supply, which would be bearish for equities. Drill, baby, drill is not what equity holders in the energy sector want the Republican nominee to be committing to, because the industry has shown very little in the way of its ability to discipline itself in that regard. And if Harris wins and the EPA gains the upper hand and starts to interfere with the markets, well, ironically, that is bearish for oil supply, but actually quite bullish for oil equities. And even though, I'm sure 90+% of your typical oil and gas industry executive would probably lean right and vote Trump, in reality, a Harris administration would be best for their pocketbooks, because the EPA would effectively be imposing discipline on the industry that it has been thus far unable to impose on itself. And for all the talk on these conference calls about focusing on cash and discipline, history shows that when push comes to shove, as we're seeing with the Saudis and OPEC, game theory is such that the ability to resist the temptation to make it up on volume is a very difficult one. And so, Trump would be bearish for oil equities, and Harris, ironically, would be quite bullish for them.
And that's because of the mismanagement that you would see from the Harris side as opposed to the Trump side.
If they make drilling more difficult, then that's good for oil equities. And if they make drilling easier, i.e. Trump, that's bearish for oil equities. But I told you we had a bit of a counterintuitive view on the matter. Oil and gas companies make a ton of money during Democratic administrations. If it's harder to drill, that's good for everybody. It might not be good for the owners of any particular project that's being blocked, but because oil and gas products are highly inelastic, if the administration imposes a moratorium on drilling or makes the drilling of new wells more difficult, well, that's very bullish for price, bearish for supply. And the thing that drives the value of oil and gas equities is price, not volume. And so if oil were $100 today, oil and gas stocks would be much higher. Ask yourself a simple question: is oil likely to get to $100 under Harris or Trump? I think the answer is obvious. It's Harris. So
right,
that's our view. Yeah.
How do you reconcile the record year that we had in oil production here in the United States last year?
If it weren't for the Biden administration, it would have been even more, right? Because if we had the necessary pipelines to get all of the gas out of the various shale fields and to bring oil to market, and if the LNG export ban hadn't caused some concerns about whether incremental investments in the U.S. would be wise, if the spigots were even wider open, we would have produced even more. And in fact, that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Like all of the sort of state-driven permitting, which was much easier than when it crosses state lines or international borders, of course, which then requires the feds to intervene in a significant way. If we had the Keystone Pipeline today, it'd be, just think of if the Mountain Valley Pipeline had been constructed years ago as opposed to impeded, you would have far more production going on in the U.S. today. And the fact that we don't is actually a saving grace for the industry.
Gotcha. And let's go ahead and shift over to China really quick. China appears to be in this rate cutting cycle. Their markets are ripping as we speak. What do you make of China's current policy decision, as well as the ramifications that decision will have on the greater markets, as well as maybe even the energy markets or commodity space?
Yeah, figuring out what China does domestically is rather complex to an outsider. It does appear that the CCP has fired a giant bazooka, reminiscent of what the Fed did after the great financial crisis, and perhaps even on par with what was done during the COVID crisis. I suppose one would say that that's testimony to just how bad the internals must have been for Xi Jinping to make a move like that. But the old adage is, don't bet against the Fed. I mean, they have a one-party, strongly dictatorial system in China, and if Xi Jinping wants the numbers to go up, then the numbers will go up. This does, the recession crowd, the pro-recession crowd that is assuming that China is in the middle of a crisis, this sort of takes away those arguments, because it would appear as though they're just going to print their way into at least some nominal growth. So it remains to be seen. I think we'll see it in the demand for commodities, and it looks as though there's some real backing to that. If it's bullish for China, it's probably bullish for or demand for oil and gas, which is bullish, all things being equal, for price. Although again, China's diversification is having an impact on the market. And then I would just say there's a major BRICS conference coming up, which I'm sure maybe we'll talk about. But one of the things we're looking for at this meeting in Kazan is whether the Power Siberia 2 pipeline, which is meant to redirect essentially natural gas flows from Europe to China, whether that gets approved during that conference or is announced during that conference, is something that we're watching very closely, because that would be, again, an example of a rewiring of global energy arteries that would be consequential for decades to come. So all eyes on China. You know, we just did for our Pro Tier, we just did a presentation last month called The Year of the Dragon, China Through the Lens of Energy, where we tried our best to understand all of the flows in China. And so interested listeners could maybe head over to that and join our Pro Tier and have a listen for it.
Yeah. What other topics should people be aware of that might stem from this BRICS meeting coming up?
So we are watching very carefully. Of course, there's this rumor or speculation that the BRICS will announce a new way to balance, trade imbalances in global trade. The so-called the unit, which is sort of a basket of BRICS currencies and backed at least partially by gold, which I think is why we're seeing this sort of endlessly higher grind up in gold prices in the past few months, which frankly is beginning to spook me a little bit, because it feels like it's run pretty far pretty quickly and might be due for a pullback. But if gold is being reasserted as a critical component in the neutral reserve asset at the heart of a new BRICS trading system, that would obviously be consequential. Again, they say like decades in weeks. That would be a decades in weeks type moment, potentially. We'll see if it gets done. We wrote a piece speculating whether Brazil might scuttle the meeting, a bit of a long shot prediction. So that's the big thing that everybody's watching is this battle between Russia and China, essentially, against the US dollar hegemony and the US sanctions regime. And this all stems from the war in Ukraine and tensions over Taiwan and China's desire to insulate itself from any exposure to US sanctions and so on. And so the global South is going to have a response to what the Americans and the British have been up to for the past few decades. And one wonders whether this upcoming meeting in Kazan might not be a historic one.
I see. Does China benefit from a war with one of its partners in BRICS? Like, do they benefit from a Ukraine and Russia war? Do they benefit from an Iran-Israel war, or quite the opposite?
I mean, I don't know who benefits from war, to be honest with you, other than the manufacturers of the weapons of war, I suppose. I suppose that China would prefer the US be entangled in conflicts not near its border. So to the extent that NATO weapons supplies are dwindling, or the US has to keep aircraft carriers in the Middle East, that's less weaponry that can be directed towards a conflict over Taiwan. So just in a sort of cold game theory calculation, I suppose China would like to see the US punch itself out in other theaters. Not sure that that's like a primary driver of their foreign policy, but perhaps just a benefit of the current situation that is unfolding.
I see. Doomberg, I mean, we've talked about a number of things already, but I want to get your most contrarian view out there. If you were to lay all your cards out on the table, what view that you hold would be distinct from anyone else's view? What is your most contrarian view from the herd?
Boy, I think we've been bearish oil for a while. That was pretty contrarian when we put it out. And that has proven to be a relatively, certainly if it's shaved off some bullish exposure from some of our subscribers, then I suppose we've done them a service. I would say that I would fade the prospects for war over Taiwan, just to finish the last conversation that we had. I just don't think that the US military is in a position to project power in 3 theaters at once. Now, will the Chinese take advantage of that and preemptively move? We doubt it. We suspect that China is playing a bit of a longer game than that and seem to be willing to grind things out. So I would fade conflict with China at this moment, given the fact that the US is seemingly tied up both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And then I would also say that, unfortunately, for the people of Ukraine who have suffered greatly as a consequence of the sort of global superpower conflict, I think the war in Ukraine is going to come to a much swifter resolution than perhaps people are modeling. There's this view in the West that the war is somehow at a stalemate. We suspect it's going to be a very, very tough winter in Ukraine. And we're going to see potentially, if the winter is severe, a mass migration of Ukrainians, mostly to the West, into Europe, which is a crisis that they are not really well prepared to handle. Steady state conflicts like this tend to resolve rather quickly in the same way that we saw a swift collapse in Afghanistan as it became sort of everybody knew that everyone else now knew that the situation was sort of collapsing. I think we're seeing early signs of a potential cascading collapse on the battlefield, which is not being widely reported in the Western media for obvious reasons. And so perhaps even sometime coinciding with the US election. We watched with interest Zelensky's trip to the US, and what he did and did not get from the Biden administration. So that's probably a couple of predictions that we would put out there that might not be on people's radars.
Yeah, the last time we spoke was about a few months ago, and we were, you and I were both very concerned about the war in Ukraine, of it going even more kinetic than it already has. What's changed to lead up to this kind of shift in tension?
So a couple of things, not to get too much into the weeds, but Ukraine diverted some of its best soldiers to embark on an offensive in a Kursk region in the sort of northern part of Ukraine on the Russia border, and they have actually occupied some villages on the Russian side of the border, which I think Zelensky and team were hoping would provoke some kind of a crisis in Moscow. The longtime dream of NATO and its allies is that somehow Putin is destabilized and regime change can be executed in Moscow. But in so diverting their best troops, they seem to basically be sort of trapped and are being slowly pounded upon by the Russians from, with their own supply chains that reach back to infinity effectively because it's their home country. And then as a consequence of diverting their best forces from the real battle lines in the Donbass, we're seeing substantial Russian victories on the battlefield and a few more strongholds to the west. And there aren't that many strongholds left all the way to the sort of Dnieper River. And so this is where we think that gambit to try to, quote, embarrass Putin by invading Russian territory under the assumption that this would be destabilizing to the Russian domestic political situation, I think was a gamble that many in the Ukrainian military opposed, but they went for it anyway. And now they're losing their best troops at a time when they need them, and their newest recruits don't seem to be as well trained. This is what happens in wars of attrition. Russia is a bigger country with a far more powerful manufacturing base, and supplying Ukraine from our supply chains thousands of miles away is proving to be a greater challenge than perhaps we anticipated. And so none of this, of course, is being reported, thoroughly in the West, and you sort of have to sneak your way around the internet to see alternative views as to what's actually going on the ground. So if you ask me for a contrarian view compared to what's being spun over here, that would be it.
I see. And then shifting over to the Middle East theater, you see that getting worse? Do you see that escalating? If you were to place a bet on it, do you see it escalating from here, or being fairly contained in that region?
To be fully transparent, the tensions between the Sunni and Shia and Israel and who's allied with who is sort of beyond our zone of expertise, I think. It's an incredibly complicated region with more than a century now of substantial tensions over the same issues. I would hope that a wider war can be avoided. The oil market is acting as though a wider war can be avoided. It's not clear that a wider war could be won by either side. And so not sure whether it's in Israel's best interest, for example, to provoke a wider geopolitical war, although Benjamin Netanyahu does seem to be intent on doing so. If we see a minor incursion into Lebanon and sort of an ongoing simmering conflict that we're seeing now, then that's one thing. If Iran starts launching, ballistic missiles from its own territory and or from its proxies into, Tel Aviv and so on, well, then of course I think we would see a wider war. Who would win that war remains to be seen. Lord knows we've been, I'd say, surprised by what has been going on in Russia and Ukraine. And once, what we like to say, one of the reasons you don't start wars is you might lose them. Israel, for all of the power it's projecting right now, and it is doing remarkable things, sometimes controversial things like the pagers and the walkie-talkies, and the decapitation of the Hezbollah regime over the weekend was certainly testimony to, Israel's military intelligence apparatus, which has long been legendary. Whether you're a friend or foe of Israel, you have to acknowledge the skill and the effectiveness of the Mossad, for example. But it's just universally true. One of the reasons you don't start wars is because you might lose them. And Israel had some challenges. Its economy is in free fall. There's only so many weapons that can be supplied to Israel, whether they want to, deplete them for the political objectives of this current government. It's also a democracy with widely held views. There are many people in Israel who oppose what's going on. And of course, it seems a majority certainly support it. And I don't live there. I don't have personal ties. It's easy for us as outsiders to look in and say what should or should not be done. We're not living in Israel and being bombarded with missiles, and we're not Palestinians living under quote unquote occupation. So it's very difficult for me, as I said at the very beginning of this answer, it's not really our zone of expertise. And so just as an outsider like you, we would just certainly hope that a wider war can be avoided.
Right. And all of this appears to be, or could potentially be tied to a rising gold price. Well, while the oil price isn't really capturing any of this risk, do you think this rising gold price is, or is it mainly, is it a signal for something else that, you may or may not know, but if you had to, put something out, put a guess out there, what would it be?
I mean, I think it's far more likely that whatever is being cooked up by the BRICS countries is behind the rising price of oil. And I don't think that the war in the Middle East is necessarily all that important to the price of oil. And we would assume that the war in the Middle East would be far more important to the price of oil, especially if some of the key shipping lanes come under further assault, the Straits of Hormuz and all of that standard stuff, would be a substantial crisis, to be sure. So I think the price of gold is doing its own thing, independent of what's going on in the Middle East.
Hey guys, quick pause. I won't take too much of your time, but if you're looking to add into your gold and silver stack, please consider Miles Franklin. More specifically, email them, info@milesfranklin.com, and tell them that Capital Cosmos sent you in the subject line to unlock special pricing that you won't find on the website. In the unlikely event that you don't like the prices, you could always not buy. There's no commitment necessary, but I do recommend Miles Franklin for a number of reasons. The customer support is top notch, the prices are great, and I know the people there. Great people all around. So with all that said, let's get back to the video. Thanks, guys.
I see. So, Doomberg, your name is Doomberg after all. So I have to ask you this. What is your biggest black pill at the moment?
Yeah, I think crossing Russian red lines, which many people in the West assume that Putin doesn't have them, and we've quote unquote crossed his red lines and he's done nothing. I think they've signaled very clearly that Western long-range missiles fired into, pre-2014 Russian territory would be a red line. I note with some trepidation that they are making moves to lower their nuclear threshold and have been very blunt with their American counterparts that this is in direct response to such a threat. I think we did again another Doom Zoom for our Pro Tier a few months ago called Geopolitics and War: Sleepwalking into the Abyss. I don't think the average American, for example, understands what the consequences of a nuclear war with Russia would be. I remember growing up hiding under the desk during drills in school because, we understood that the Soviet Union back then was a major nuclear superpower and we should tread carefully. And we would expect that they would tread carefully with us. As we saw with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close to having a nuclear war with Russia. Russia is stating very clearly that nuclear weapons are on the table if NATO crosses these red lines. Now, you may think that is a baseless threat. It's still it's sort of an expected value, probability times consequence, like a nuclear war with the world's largest nuclear superpower. They have a larger stockpile of nuclear weapons than the US, and we would presume perhaps even more modern. They have nuclear armed submarines all over the world, just like we do. Do we want to go down this road? This is, I think the thing that amazes me is how close we're coming to such an outcome and how little it is being discussed or pondered in the West. It is being discussed and pondered in Russia 24/7, I can assure you. And so that is probably, the greatest black pill.
And conversely, what would be your greatest white pill?
Well, I think if we could figure out a way to find a peaceful settlement to these conflicts and get back to the business of running our economies for the benefit of the citizens of our countries, as opposed to engaging in these various conflicts, justified or unjustified as they might be. In the long run, the human endeavor requires us to lift all of the other humans on this planet out of the poverty that they currently experience. I think it's totally doable. We have an abundance of energy. We have an abundance of technology. AI is making all of this far more easier. And as a student of AI and a heavy user of it, I can tell you that the things are moving in that space. Whether or not they manifest in various stock prices is for others to figure out. But the underlying technology is moving at an incredible pace, and we're actually pretty optimistic about that. So, not to get too Star Trek on you, but if there was a future where we could sort of prevent wars from happening and disputes were settled to the benefit of all parties with some reasonable compromises, I think that would be a much better world and one that we should all be striving for.
Yeah. So we've talked about the two extremes, or the two sides of the coins, but in terms of your view, what is your base case moving forward? Not what ought to happen or what could happen, what could happen on the two extremes, the very positive and the very negative, but from a objective point of view, moving forward for the next year or two, how do you see things kind of shaping up?
The base case is perhaps just the one that we desire. Some form of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine that ends hostilities, a capping of the tensions in the Middle East that at least allows for a bit of a back to normal, and then a clean win by either party in the U.S. election, one way or the other, would be sort of the base case. But base and most probable, I suppose, are two slightly different things. There are all manner of potential points of doom on the horizon that one needs to be mindful of. The good news, of course, is for us, there's no shortage of things to write about over time. But our base case would be, like one of the things we worry a lot about, and we even pointed this out in this presentation many months ago, sleepwalking into the abyss. Like, how does NATO respond to a loss against Russia? Because that's what it's staring at today. How NATO responds to a loss is a key inflection point. And so that's probably, what we spend a lot of time thinking about. If Trump comes in and, I'm going to solve this war in one day. Well, the Ukrainians might not like what it takes to solve the war in one day, given the realities on the ground. But how NATO responds to a loss is difficult to envision in the context of any base case, because if you just look at the differences right now in the rhetoric between the Ukrainians and NATO on one side and the reality on the ground, the chasm is very, very wide, and how that chasm closes is the thing that we're watching most closely.
And if you were to lay all your cards out on the table and you had to pick one viewpoint that you have that has the highest probability of being wrong, what would it be?
Well, our current view is that NATO and the US will not escalate, that forces in the Pentagon are opposed to escalation, which necessarily means that we have to peacefully accept a loss. If we're wrong on that, all bets are off. Because, it doesn't take much in the way of mutual escalation for things to get really out of hand. If we wake up one day and we find that a carrier has been sunk by presumably, some Houthis given missiles by Russia, what happens after that, Danny? I don't know. So the current base case is that the military situation continues to evolve in Russia, Ukraine with the current momentum. We perhaps see a collapse. A significant portion of what Zelensky would call, and what we would all assume was Ukraine before even the invasion of Crimea, will end up being declared as Russian territory by the Russians. Then the question is, what, if anything, can or will we do about it, right? We don't seem to be able to be holding back the Red Army at the moment. And by the way, I mean, this is like forever thus. The Red Army knows how to march from east to west. They win wars of attrition. I think a critical mistake we've made is radically underestimating both the military, manufacturing, and energy resources of Russia. We thought, that outbreak of war might cause Putin's regime to topple. It hasn't. So if we lose that war, and we do so in a way that, of course, is very upsetting to the Ukrainians, but avoids a wider war, again, if we're wrong about that, then every other aspect of analysis needs to be reconsidered. If you have a potential or even a probability of nuclear weapons being exchanged, then no operating model of how the economy works, or stock markets, or geopolitics is really tuned to predicting the outcome of such a wild event.
Well, hey, tell us where people can find you.
Yeah, you just find everything at Doomberg.com. Nice and simple. We own that domain name now, finally. So all of our podcast appearances are listed there. Our pro tier presentations are there. Our articles are there. We have two major offerings, our articles, and then stepping up to our pro tier, where we do an in-depth presentation once a month for those subscribers. We're about to release one shortly after finishing this recording, called Water Everywhere, where we do an interesting deep dive of the water markets, which are basically a derivative of the energy markets. And those are fun to put together. They usually run about 45 minutes. And our objective is to teach our pro tier to look at such big markets in the way that we do. And we have a lot of fun putting those together. And then they eventually become foundations of future articles as well. So, Danny, it was always great to talk to you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And congratulations on your launch of your Substack and all the success that you're having.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it, Doomberg. Thank you so much for coming on again. It's always a pleasure talking to you and getting your insights. And if you guys enjoyed this content, be sure to give us a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to get more of this content on your feed, as well as check out our Substack for the extended portion of this interview. Link to that is down below. And until next time, guys, I'll see you later. Bye, y'all.
So if you live in Israel or Lebanon, or if you live in Ukraine or in Russia, or if you live in China or Taiwan, you're seeing a radically different view of the world than I'm seeing. Everybody assumes they're more capable than average of shedding or spotting propaganda and minimizing its effect on your own personal journey towards objective truth. We at least acknowledge and recognize that. Many people don't. But we are trying our best to swim through a thick wall of propaganda in our efforts to understand what's actually going on.